Today we have Ortwin Renn, who has spoken with us a few times, once or twice before. Ortwin and I have known each other for some years now, early days of risk work and so on. But it caught my attention. His book, which I have. He'd written a book on risk governance, and this chapter around how to use, or at least classification of Greek mythologies to help us understand risk and classification of risk and so on. I'll let Ortwin speak, but it caught my attention. So I asked him, Ortwin, would you share 10, 15 minutes of your thoughts on this subject? I'm sure the group would like it, particularly in light of course, AI, but many other risks that seem to be around us, and so reflect on that. And we generally don't do introductions, so Ortwin, why don't you please share your thoughts, and we'll let the discussion go where it will.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. I hope you can hear me well. Also, I just shared my slides with you. I hope you can see them.
Good. Yeah.
Is that okay?
Yep.
All right, fine. So I want to talk about integrated risk governance, and the subtitle is, and okay, Yatin alluded to that already, what Greek mythology can tell us about systemic risks. So I would start with the some kind of what we call risk basics. And first say a little bit about the terms that I'm going to use. I mean, that's fairly obvious. Risk is, in a very general term, possibility of experiencing harm. Possibility can be classified and or quantified in terms of probabilities. Sometimes it cannot, and we're not talking about positive impacts, but negative impacts. The key terms are hazard is a potential to cause harm, so it doesn't have to be materialized. So a knife could be a hazard as well as a chemical, but it doesn't do harm unless it is somehow somebody's exposed to that hazard and then have some kind of an impact. We have risk agents that come back to this. These are the carriers of hazard. Those are the ones that actually do the damage. We have the risk-absorbing systems. That's the endpoint or target for hazard release. It could be a human being, it could be an ecosystem, it could be a building or wealth, whatever. Exposure, which I talked about it, is that the target is affected by one of these agents. Vulnerability is the fact to which a risk-absorbing system is affected by a risk vector or risk agent. So high vulnerability means that a risk agent can do a lot of harm. Low vulnerability or high resilience means that this kind of risk agent can only do little harm because the system is well prepared to deal with it. Then we talked about agents. If we take that, so we basically have two major components in a system perspective. One is that risk agents or vectors are often interacting, and we have risk-absorbing systems. These are targets that are being impacted. Now, the interesting thing is in all the risks that we're talking about, we basically only have 5. So there's 3 physical risks: is energy in all its form, radiation, chemical energy, kinetic energy. There's substance in all its toxicity, and there's biota, of course, bacteria, viruses, and so on. But we also have social risk vectors or social risk agents, basically information and power. Information includes money, power includes violence. Those could also be triggers or carriers, better said, of risk. Now, the causes may be millions of different causes, but they do either release energy or they do release substance or biota or release information or release power. And then they either amplify or attenuate the impacts. And if we look really at the risk agents, then we probably go along with it by probabilistic risk analysis. If you look at risk-absorbing systems, you're looking into vulnerability and resilience. Now, we normally think about 3 challenges of knowledge about risk, and those are the 3 challenges I want to talk about. And again, I'll get to the Greek mythology in a minute. First is complexity, and complexity means that there is a lot of intervening variables between a cause and an effect, a lot of feedbacks, and a lot of linear and nonlinear relationships. And that is always between causal, temporal, or functional relationships. We have uncertainty. A risk always have some kind of uncertainty, otherwise it wouldn't be a risk, but a certainty. And that can be incomplete knowledge because it's epistemic uncertainty. It could be limited stochastic modeling, that's modeling uncertainties. And we have, of course, aleatory uncertainties, which is that there are random elements that play into the cause-effect relationships. And then we have ambiguity interpreting results. That is that we may evaluate risks differently, like the glass is half full or half empty. Is something really a damage or not a damage, or is it a harm or not a harm? Think about, let's say, non-ionizing radiation. Also, we have to think about different types of impacts. Some are positive, some are negative. Is that a risk or is that a benefit? So all of that leads to more ambiguity. Ambiguity is something, or all three of these things are problems with communicating scientific challenges. And I just want to get to this briefly because very often that's part of the problem that we have when we try to communicate about risks. So complexity defies public wisdom and intuition. Normally we think linearly, we think everything that's close by or is close in terms of time or location is most likely to be a cause. And complex systems, that's not the case. And learning by trial and error may be totally inadequate because we have very often tipping points and we get very positive feedback until it's too late. We have uncertainty that disappoints public expectation for certainty. A lot of the attractiveness of conspiracy theories come from the quest for certainty. Conspiracy theories are always certain. They never have anything related to uncertainty. It also provides justification for opposite viewpoints. Always think about smokers. The smoker says it won't happen to me. I'm on the left side of the normal distribution curve, and the non-smoker said any cigarette will kill me. He's on the opposite side of the Gaussian normal distribution curve. And so there are different types of justification depending if you're affected or not. And they're still not wrong. They're just, you are not going close to the median value. And there's always a risk of decreasing legitimacy. Think about, for example, vaccination in the COVID case. If everybody who was vaccinated would not get it, I think vaccination would not be in any way jeopardized. But since there's only a percentage of people that get safer, even if it's a high percentage, or if a very high percentage don't have very lethal effects, then people still say, well, but there were some that still died. And so it's difficult to legitimize kind of actions that people don't like. And ambiguity always leaves the impression of arbitrariness or interest-driven motivations. So that basically is saying, well, if you can evaluate it in different ways, I evaluate it in a way that, it really benefits myself. And that makes it sometimes very difficult to communicate about risk and also to do policies about risk. Now, this has, of course, implications for governance. And very briefly, let me say this is an IRGC risk governance model. It has a pre-assessment. There's, framing, basically. The appraisal, which I will tell you is both. It's a concern assessment and also the risk assessment that needs to be characterized and evaluated and then managed. And all of that is a part of the major communication arena. So we have implications of risk assessment, appraisal, evaluation, management, and risk communication participation. When we talk about risk appraisal, and use the word appraisal, not assessment here, because we have two types of assessment in the IRGC model. One is risk assessment, which we all know about. We identify the hazard, we identify and estimate is what is at stake, who is potentially exposed. Then we're trying to find out the exposure assessment, who is affected to what degree. And then we have a dose response model or cause effect model, which then gives out the risk estimation over time and a specific population. In addition to this, the IRGC also wanted to see that we look into concern assessment. So those are socioeconomic impacts, what domains of life are also affected in addition, for example, to health. What are the perceived benefits and risks? What do we fear? We all know that perceptions drive behavior, not facts. So very important to get into the perceptions. And do we have public concerns, specifically with stakeholders and groups? What do they worry about? And that, of course, has a major impact on policymaking. There are a whole set of challenges for these kinds of risk assessments and concerns assessment. One is that all the effects, as I said, with the agents are interacting. So we have to include physical, social, political, economic, and psychological risk at the same time. We need to use better tools to assess complex and systemic risks. We should place more weight on perception of risk and social mobilization, because that is what has an impact on the policy level, and we need to see how that works. We have to take account now what people call polycrisis, so multiple risks at the same time. They're interconnected. They're either kind of a contagious model in which one risk basically spreads over to the next, or we have a cascading risk where one leads to impacts on other types of risk, and they lead to other risks and so on. It's like the domino game. And we need to provide better rationales for balancing risk, benefits, and perceptions. All of that is an element of what we need in also in terms of risk assessment, but also for risk management. And that now leads us, we're getting closer to the Greeks, but first to the evaluation. That's all what you know of. This is the so-called traffic light model. Once you have assessed the risk, you ask yourself, is it acceptable? Meaning, what is the likelihood of probability that's happening, and what is the extent of consequences? And if both of them are fairly low, then it's acceptable. There is a large degree where you say, okay, benefit is worth the risk, but a risk reduction are necessary. So you need to have some regulation here. And then you have the red point where you say risk is so great, you don't think that the benefit can compensate for the risks, and you should probably prohibit it or make sure that that risk doesn't happen or whatever, if the natural disaster don't live there. So this is a kind of traffic model. And then if we go into risk management, then we can see that we have a kind of a different risk evaluation or management criteria. And those are the kind of factors that matter. So it's probability, sure, potential for harm. Those are the classic one. But we also have to look, how much uncertainty do we have? Also there is something, if we have a very highly uncertain risk, do we really want to give a crude estimate for the potential of harm or probability, or should we take a more precautionary approach? Then we have ubiquity. So how ubiquitous is it? So including intergenerational equity, how persistent is something? Are there delayed effects? Are there equity violations? Are only a few people that we can actually identify are affected by the risk, or the whole population? Are there marginalized groups that are specifically at risk? And the potential for social mobilization because of perception and so on. And if we take those factors seriously, we have kind of different risk clusters. Yeah? And these are the risk clusters, and they have indeed Greek names. So we have first, we can start with the Damocles. Maybe you're familiar with it. The Damocles sword was hanging above the king, and the king never knew when it was falling down, so he never slept. But the legend said that the sword never fell. So in that sense, it was a very unlikely event. So the Damocles are these kind of very unlikely event with a high extent of damage. So low probability, high consequence risks. The Cyclops is one thing where, you know pretty well the extent of damage, but you don't know the probability. So, something is really bad is going to happen. Let's take, for example, the Gulf Stream would cease, it would not work anymore. We know that the extent of damage what that would take, but we don't know the probability at this point. Then we have the Pythia, where we have both high uncertainties on both on the extent of damage, but also on the probability. Then we have the Cassandra, where we have clearly something that's bad in terms of extent, but also bad in terms of probability, but nobody cares. And the Medussa is the opposite, where, it's actually not a bad type of risk. It's low in extent, low in damage, but people are really scared about it. So this is a phantom risk. These are the forgotten risks. And the Pandora is one where we know there is a causal relationship, but we cannot quantify it. So it's something where we have absolutely no idea how to quantify it. I put this down here to see Damocles, high catastrophic potential, probabilities widely known. Nuclear energy would be, I think, a good example. The Cyclops, no reliable estimate of probabilities, but high catastrophic potential that we know of. So something that's really bad, but we don't know the probability and we don't know when it's happening. Big meteorite hitting the Earth, or some of the climate change boundaries being trespassed and so on. Pythia is causal connection confirmed, damage potential, probabilities unknown or indeterminable. So that's something where clearly the kind of a precautionary approach would be appropriate. Pandora, causal connection unclear or challenged, high persistency and ubiquity. So this is the one I said before. Then the Cassandra is an unacceptable risk, but long delay between causal stimulus and negative effect. That's normally the case, but it's basically a risk that's not being taken seriously, just like Cassandra was not taken seriously. And Medussa, perception of high risk among individuals and lack potential for social modulation without a clear scientific evidence for serious harm. Now, if we take these kind of characterizations of risks, we can also say then we have specific risk management strategies. We have the linear risk management strategy, which basically everything is low, everything is known. So we have sufficient knowledge of key parameters, little complexity. Standard assessment is sufficient. Then we do risk-benefit analysis as a basic tool for evaluation, and management is pretty clear. In a risk-informed management, we have high complexity of causal risk models. So either uncertainty or extent of damage is not very clear. It needs to be modeled. So we are in the realm of Pythia or Pandora. We need an expanded risk assessment, need for knowledge management tools. We need to have epistemic discourse. It's probably good emphasis on robust risk management strategies to think about that the less likely but not impossible model will prevail. And so we need risk standards, including safety factors in dealing with ranges of impact. And there's always an emphasis on close monitoring. Now, if you go to precaution-based management, that is where we really have the Pythia and Pandora case. A high second-order uncertainty, meaning we cannot quantify it completely. Adverse effects are plausible, but quantification at this point is not reliable. The limits of knowledge, we can characterize uncertainty by non-statistical means, so in a more narrative review. And there's a goal of risk management is avoidance of irreversible effects. That's kind of the precaution-based management. And there are instruments like, one would be negotiation between too little and too much precaution. So you negotiate between the potential victims of a risk and the potential beneficiaries of a risk. And if one can, whatever, pay an insurance for the others, then it may be acceptable. There's a classic one, ALARA, as low as reasonable. So that's just kind of minimization principle. And there's something like containing of risk so that you can really have no irreversible effects. Then you have discourse-based management, the last one with high ambiguity is to find common understanding among stakeholders. That's where we have a lot of differences in evaluation of risk, whether they are acceptable or not acceptable. And we need legitimate procedures for making collectively binding decisions. For example, nuclear waste management is something where, we have a lot of public consultations and stakeholders involvement because everybody has a different view on this. So stakeholder involvement, public debate, risk communications are the main instruments here. And yeah, I'll skip this one. We have implications for decision making. You see here, this is the so-called stakeholder involvement letter. Those are the kind of the risk types, again, simple, complex, uncertain, and ambiguous. And then you can see that if it's kind of simple, we just need agency staff as an instrumental discourse. And the objective is to find the most cost-effective way to make the risk acceptable and tolerable. If the risk is very complex, so if you don't have good knowledge about the probabilities and or the impact or other types of things, then we need other external scientists and research to come in. The discourse becomes not instrumental, but epistemic, what's true. We use experts to find valid, reliable, and relevant knowledge about the risk. And then if you can do this, we can model the risk, then we can also do, again, cost-benefit analysis or whatever types of risk-benefit balancing. The next step, of course, is uncertainty. Where the uncertainty cannot be resolved by modeling, then very good to have affected stakeholders be part of this, because some are the victims, some are the beneficiaries. I think if they can negotiate something between them, then this would be, of course, an interesting way to resolve the conflict. You need to affect stakeholders to collectively decide the best way forward. And the last thing is you have a lot of ambiguity, whatever, let's say, on genetically modified organisms or things where even the benefits are controversial. Then you need also have civil society involved, and you have a participatory discourse, and include all actors who has to expose, accept, and discuss and resolve differences. So this is the one where we need a lot of public input, because it depends on the evaluative criteria whether you will take the risk or not so much on the extent of the risk itself. Yeah, so this is complexity. The set would need an epistemic discourse. There's a need for scientific consensus. If we have high uncertainty, we need a discourse, a message for signing trade-offs. We need a consensus on criteria to assure effective, efficient, fair, and resilient solutions. And stakeholder participation is essential. And an ambiguity is also what is the best option. We may even go step back and saying, well, is there another option that provides the same or a similar benefit without the risk? Who is affected to what degree? If there are a lot of equity issues, and there's certainly a need for trade-offs. Yeah, then I come to my conclusions, and then I'm happy for the discussion. Risk are characterized by different degrees of complexity, uncertainty, ambiguity. Addressing these three challenges is crucial for a successful communication participation between scientific experts, stakeholders, policymakers, and the affected publics. The Greek metaphors can help us to systematize expert knowledge, identify trade-offs, and get stakeholder public input for resolving conflict. We get even a roadmap for this with using those metaphors. Societal input is needed for understanding concerns and providing pragmatic guidelines to resolve ambiguity and to handle uncertainty. And then conclusions number 2, we have 3 major management styles: the risk-informed management style, where we have expanded risk assessments, including more complex structures, seeking expert models, and state-of-the-art assessments to improve our knowledge about the causal relationships within the risk field. Resilience or precaution-based management means increasing passive safety and security, rely on resilient technologies such as redundancies and diversity or other protective devices to include or to increase the resilience of a system, because we're not quite sure how bad or how good it is. And inclusive management is the one where we have a lot of ambiguity. There has an emphasis on communication, seeking more public input and stakeholder involvement for alerting users to the opportunities and risks, develop forums for consensus rules for effective resilience and fair solutions. Okay, that's what I would like to say, and thank you very much for your attention.